Hi. So I wanted to make another queer book video before Pride Month is over, and I'm a sucker for a sad book. Like, if a book makes me cry, it immediately goes to like my top 10 favorite books. And I know everyone is really sick of gay tragedies, but I'm a queer and I love gay sad books, so I wanted to talk about a few. A bit of a disclaimer, these are all books about like white cis gay men. So unfortunately, the gay sad book genre doesn't have a lot of diversity, or at least I haven't found a lot of diversity in it. But anyway, it's good enough if you want to cry. So I'm gonna go through these in order of how much I cried, from least to most. So the first book I want to talk about is Swimming in the Dark by Tomas Niedrowski. This is a recent book I got. I read it for the Queer Lit Readathon as well, which you may have seen. This is a sad book, but it wasn't like heart-wrenching, for me at least. Because even though the love story in it like ended, things kind of went pretty good for the main character. Like, I wouldn't say the ending is super sad, but it's kind of sad. It talks about a gay guy named Ludwig in the 80s in Poland. So this is during like communist rule. Homosexuality was a criminal offense. It's from the perspective of the future, and he's like writing to his love interest in the book, Janusz. Maybe I'm saying that wrong. I don't know. Sorry. And we find out from the beginning that Ludwig has kind of moved to America, and he's following the news in Poland and thinking back on kind of his romance with Janusz, and like wondering how he's doing now, because obviously there's not really any way of contacting him, I guess. Kind of goes over the whole story of how, first of all, how he even realized he was gay quite early on as a kid, and then how he had his first like sexual experience with a man, and then how his relationship with Janusz develops. In addition to the whole romance plot, there is also a really big kind of political aspect to the book, because one of the main conflicts between Ludwig and Janusz is their political views, because Janusz is really unhappy living in Poland, where he can't be free as a gay man, as himself, and he really wants to get out of the country. But Ludwig is quite happy in Poland. He is quite happy with the idea of just being together forever and hiding the relationship, pretending to be like friends living together. And he thinks that moving to like America or whatever is just gonna make his life really difficult, because living in capitalism is difficult. So I thought it was really interesting how we got these kind of two very different perspectives of this regime, and the author himself is also Polish. So yeah, and it also describes what life in kind of the Eastern Bloc was like in the 80s in what I thought was quite an accurate way. So I think it would be interesting for people who maybe don't know that much about like the Soviet era and the Eastern Bloc and all of that, because I haven't really seen a lot of books around that are set in that era in a realistic way. So my next book is Maggot Moon, which has kind of a similar setting actually. It's kind of a fictional dystopia of the UK, and I think it's based on like on the Soviet Union, because it sounded very similar in some ways. And this talks about a young boy who grows up in this society, kind of all the horrors that he goes through, everything he sees, and then he meets another young boy who moves into the house next to him, and they become very good friends, and then shit goes down. I don't really want to give any spoilers. I'll be honest, this isn't like a canon gay fiction. They're children, and it's a platonic relationship generally. There's one scene at the end that hints at something more, and for me the ending just felt like, I feel like it counts as a sad gay book. And it's quite a quick read. I just reread this recently as well. and it's quite good. So, third is another one from my Queer Lit Reading Rush, which I'm not going to say the name of. But this is like an old favorite book of mine, and I recently reread it again. This is an autobiography about a boy growing up in a Romani community in England, and about his struggles basically living in this super macho world where his father is expecting him to be like this really tough fighter, and he's just not able to live up to expectations. There's a lot of abuse in this book, physical, sexual, so trigger warning for all of that kind of stuff. It's kind of different from most sad books because usually you have the ending that becomes really sad, but with this one, it's like the first 90% of the book is really difficult to read and really kind of heart-wrenching. But then the end is quite happy. Picks up all the broken pieces of your heart and tells you everything's gonna be okay. So my last two books I don't have a physical copy of, unfortunately. The first one is The Great Believers by Rebecca Mccoy. This one is about the AIDS crisis in the 80s, set in Chicago. It has a dual perspective thing, so it switches between the perspective of a gay man living through the AIDS crisis, seeing all of his friends. We all know how terrible that era was, so I don't really need to get into detail, I don't think. And the second narrative is about 30 years in the future, of the sister of one of Nico's friends. She's a little sister, and she was very in the community, in the LGBT community, with her brother back in the 80s, and she was kind of one of the people who was helping to take care of everybody who was getting sick. And now 30 years later, she finds herself in Paris. She's looking for her daughter, and she also kind of meets this guy who was also involved with the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and it kind of brings back a lot of repressed trauma memories, and she's kind of just working through everything that she's been through. This one I haven't read since I first read it, like more than a year ago, but I do remember it being really sad. Like, if you've ever like consumed any media about the AIDS crisis, you probably know how like really heart-wrenching that is. So yeah, tread carefully. And my first place book is definitely Giovanni by James Baldwin. I read this quite recently. I didn't really know a lot about it, and just from like the first few pages I knew that this book was gonna break me. It's not so much about the plot, even though the plot is also very sad. It's more just the narrative, the way that it's written. So the book is about this American man, David, who is in Paris. He's been traveling with his girlfriend, and she kind of leaves to go to Spain or something for a few months. So David is alone in Paris, and then one night he meets this man called Giovanni, and they start a relationship. David did kind of know before as well that he was interested in men, because he'd had an experience in his youth, but it was something that he had kind of repressed, I think. And I mean, throughout the whole book, I think repression was a really big theme. He just wasn't really able to come to terms with that part of himself, and he wasn't able to really love Giovanni the way he needed. Giovanni was also, I mean, he seemed really depressed, like in a more kind of a more explicit way than David. Because he'd just get really sad that David wasn't into the relationship as seriously as Giovanni was. Yeah, and this book is also told from the perspective of the future, where he's left Paris and he's kind of looking back on everything that happened in Paris, because he's recently heard the news that Giovanni is being sentenced to death the next day yeah, the story kind of goes over one night or something. And we don't find out why Giovanni is sentenced to death until to the end of the book. And yeah, I guess that kind of knowledge that the character is about to die as well kind of adds a whole other layer of sadness. This was a really, like, I flew through the book, but the whole time I felt completely broken inside. And like, I'm not exaggerating when I say that the whole day after I finished reading it, I just felt sad. It's really, really like, just rips out your heart. I don't know. It was a really difficult book to read. And the book actually features in the first book I talked about, Swimming in the Dark. So personally, I would recommend reading Giovanni's Room before you read Swimming in the Dark, because it will give you like an extra understanding of what they're talking about. And yeah, Giovanni's Room's a classic. I think every queer should read that at some point, if you're able to, because it really is like awfully sad. And yeah, that is my top 5 gay sad stories. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have something to put in your TBR pile for next time you just want to cry over something that isn't your own life. Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye. Just wanted to add, as important as stories are, it's also really important to remember the real life context of them. And I'll be adding some resources on LGBT communities in Eastern Europe, especially Poland, where things are actually pretty shit right now. LGBT communities in Romani communities, as well as some AIDS foundations. I will be adding that to the description below.